DX12 feature compatibility and a 4GB frame buffer are the de facto minimum requirements for graphics cards in 2022. This means that some popular classics like nVidia's 700 series, AMD's HD 7000s, and even some of the more modern GTX 900s no longer make the cut. In the past, I've had some luck trawling among the workstation cards for likely gaming candidates, and I think I might have come up with another underappreciated gem. The Quadro M2000 is potentially the cheapest 4GB model in the Maxwell 2 series of cards from nVidia. In 2015, this bigger frame buffer wouldn't have done much for Quadro's gaming credibility, as having double the VRAM of the GTX 950, its nearest GeForce equivalent, wasn't enough to justify the price difference. Nowadays though, that bigger buffer makes the M2000 somewhat more appealing. This extra VRAM, along with the slim single-slot design and low TDP, could make the M2000 an ideal budget sleeper for gaming in 2022, particularly for using those old Dell Optiplexes and similar mini-tower office PCs. That is, if you can get it for the right price. I got mine on eBay earlier this year for £100, which at the time was about the same price as the 2GB GTX 950. Of course, now that prices are returning to reality, you can get a lot of GPU for £100. Nowadays, £90 seems to be the going rate for an M2000, and I'd argue that that might still be too high. The existence of the £160 RX 6400 has potentially disrupted this market segment by quite a lot, so I'd be looking to pay £75 or less, maybe as low as £50. As I don't have any OEM pre-builts to hand, I'm going to be testing my sample on my usual moderately priced gaming PC with a 6-core Ryzen 5 5600G and 16GB of 3600 CL16 RAM. The base PS4 can run God of War at a fairly inconsistent 30fps using a resolution of 1080 and with quality settings that, I assume, are the same as the original preset in the PC port. This is usually my starting point with any GPU, and sadly the M2000 doesn't quite fit the bill. At PS4 equivalent settings, the game barely scrapes over 20fps. Thankfully though, one of the reasons we buy PCs is so that we can mess with settings, and a drop to 1080 low with FSR quality upscaling breaks the 30fps average barrier and only drops into the high 20s. The Final Fantasy VII Remake likewise runs at 1080 30fps on base PS4s, but the PC version is a lot more lenient thanks to a dynamic resolution that can't be switched off without modding the game. I saw over 40fps on average using 1080 with high textures and low shadows, and with the FPS cap set to its maximum. Of course, this results in a pretty soft image. This can be mitigated somewhat by dropping the cap to 30fps so that the DRS system is less inclined to drop resolution. Elden Ring is engine limited to 60fps, but you don't need to worry about that here. The M2000 is capable of 30fps at medium settings, though to get there requires dropping resolution to 1600 by 900. Staying at 1080 sees averages of about 27. In more positive news, a few known issues with this game didn't rear their ugly heads at all. Firstly, the shader compilation issue wasn't a problem during the 20 minutes or so that I was playing. Secondly, in my experience, lower-end GPUs occasionally see NPCs vanish, often in the middle of combat, but the M2000 has enough power and VRAM that this wasn't an issue. If you've been following my channel, you'll know that I've been working my way through the nVidia Maxwell series this year. You might also be aware that Guardians of the Galaxy has a bit of a problem with that architecture, and frankly it's a stupid one. At some point in the past, an nVidia driver update essentially broke these GPUs in this game, and I needed to roll back to 471.11 in order to get a decent frame rate. Actually, that might be understating things. I tried the canned benchmark at both 1080 high and low, with the same FSR balanced setting, and saw identical benchmark runs averaging 31 FPS with lows of 18. This is arguably stretching the definition of playable too far, but after a small amount of gameplay, I think I can call this just about tolerable, if not ideal. Forza Horizon 5's built-in benchmark is pretty intensive and is a worst case scenario for FPS. At 1080 medium it scored 33 FPS, which was actually quite impressive. This tiny 2016 workstation card outperformed the AMD HD 7970, a flagship GPU from 5 years earlier, and managed to do so without any unpleasant artifacts. As I prefer to run Forza at high settings, I did a second run with FSR quality and saw roughly the same frame rate. Which one you go for is entirely up to you. If I can help it, I don't usually enable dynamic resolution scaling, but I made an exception this time. Halo Infinite's not really a graphical showcase, but its developers didn't bother optimizing for anything older than Turing. This means that Maxwell cards like this one need to be dropped to unreasonably low settings just to get a playable frame rate. The dynamic scaler in Halo is thankfully pretty good. Without the scaler, 1080 low scored just 22 FPS in an open world part of the campaign. With a 30 FPS minimum in place, that same section jumped to an average of 34 FPS, with 1% lows of 28, and I saw about the same average and minimum FPS in a big team battle. I didn't try any smaller scale or indoor matches, but from my own past experience I found they run at much higher frame rates. Cyberpunk 2077 is a big ask for a little GPU, so it's unsurprising that it couldn't hit a 30 FPS target without some help. At 1080 low it barely scraped above 20 FPS. Thankfully I was testing an RX 480 at 4K medium the other day, so 20 FPS is practically a fun time by comparison. A few months back, CDPR added FSR 1 to the game, which isn't my preferred upscaler, but it is easy to use. With FSR balanced, it's possible to reach a 30 FPS average. I also tested out FSR 2 thanks to a mod, though as I've found elsewhere, this isn't really the way to get a big leap in performance. At the same balanced setting as before, it looks a hell of a lot better, but only manages 25 FPS. I still don't know much about Rainbow Six extraction. I'd assumed it'll be similar to Siege in that it wouldn't be very demanding on graphics cards, but so far that hasn't been the case. At 1080 high the benchmark only scrapes over 30 FPS on average, and for a multiplayer title this seems a bit low. Dropping quality to low and using the 75% resolution scaler bumps that figure up by almost 50%, averaging 45 with a minimum of 34. Whether or not this is good enough, I don't know. Maybe if I started playing the game, but there's so much other stuff I could be doing. Like playing Splitgate, for example. Unlike other esports shooters, Splitgate isn't overly reliant on CPU performance and scales very nicely with GPU power. My standard test config for even remotely powerful graphics cards is 1080 epic settings, which sees a fairly decent 75 FPS average. I quite like this game and I think it deserves a few more FPS than this. I missed some shots I didn't feel like I should have missed, so I'd suggest dropping a few settings to get closer to 100 FPS. Call of Duty Vanguard on the Quadro M2000 is a bit rough, but playable in a pinch. At 1080 low, the 35 FPS average and 24 FPS lows are pretty hard to stomach in a competitive environment. Thankfully, some resolution scaling can help improve matters, though the image quality does turn to crap in the process. Adding balanced FSR lifts averages over 50 FPS, which is probably fine. NTSC refresh rates are overrated anyway. PAL forever, baby. If a GPU struggles to run Fortnite in normal DX11 or DX12, these days there's always the option of performance mode. However, the M2000 is just powerful enough to satisfy the average user without having to resort to extreme low-spec destruction. 1080 low with epic view distance scores around 80 FPS, with typically Fortnite-esque 1% lows. I tried separate runs using DX11 and DX12 and saw basically no difference between the two. I also summoned the courage to try out 1080 high. 30 FPS really isn't suitable here, but if you really wanted to, Maybe if you wanted to hang out in the non-competitive game modes and admire your avatars or something, I guess it's doable. Without resorting to dynamic resolution scaling, 1080-60 isn't going to happen in Apex Legends. The M2000 can push about a 53 FPS average at 1080 low settings, with 4GB frame textures enabled, and 1% lows are a pretty dire 35 FPS. Dropping the resolution to a fixed 900 or 720, or indeed using dynamic resolution scaling, would probably do the trick, though I for one am not a fan of using low resolutions in battle royales. And continuing on that theme, Call of Duty Warzone can only manage the 51 FPS average I achieved here by using 1080 with 67% scaling, which gives a render resolution of approximately 1280 by 720. I'm not sure if any combination of anti-aliasing could help visibility here, but using the Filmic SMAA option drops FPS by a further 4 to 5 frames. Finally, yes, I know, I don't usually test GTA 5, and I know that annoys some of you, and I'm not going to change my mind about it. However, sometimes when I'm testing a card that doesn't get a lot of coverage on YouTube, I think that testing it in GTA 5 is in the public interest. 1080 High gave a relatively unstable 60 FPS plus experience, and dropping some settings or using resolution scaling might be necessary if you want to lock at 60. If you're happy with 30, however, you can safely move the settings up to very high and see a 44 FPS average and 1% lows over 29. On the one hand, this isn't the most impressive showing ever. As I said in the intro, you can get a lot of GPU for the price of this single slot low TDP workstation card in mid-2022, so paying even close to the going rate on one of these is probably not the best idea. A GTX 1050 Ti, RX 6400 or even a 1650 might be a better fit for a small, low-power PC. But if you can get one for the right price, say £50, or if you can pick one up as part of a used Office PC deal, the bottom line is, the Quadro M2000 can play anything. I mean, not always that well, but there wasn't a single game that refused to launch. And although I did have to dick around with the drivers for Guardians of the Galaxy, it never once failed to start. Depending on what the graphics card market is like in your region, this might still be worth something. Hope that was useful. Kindly do the usual YouTube things if you feel so inclined, and I'll see you next time.